Greece, chapter 4. The Greeks. The Greeks were more like us than any of the people we've talked about in two very important ways. Number one, some of them had a form of democracy. And unlike the other peoples living earlier who did not, as far as we can tell, have democracy, unless way, way, way back, some of the people living far back might have had some kind of democracy. Also, they had religious skeptics among them. Now, when I say religious skeptics, they had people who believed that the gods did not exist, or people who said, I don't know if the gods exist or not. I don't want to give you the impression they were all religious skeptics. It is suspected that 95% of the Greeks were believers in the gods, but that's a lower percentage than you find in other places, where that's perhaps if they had 5% skeptics, that's higher than other places. It looks like the other places had 100% belief in the gods. Now, they also, some of them, practiced what we might call science. They're credited with being the inventors of the Pythagorean theorem, even though we know the Egyptians did first. In addition, some of them tried to measure the size of the earth using triangulation, and some of them tried to measure the distance of the moon, again using triangulation, and some of them tried to measure the distance to the sun, or even measure the size of the sun. Now, their figures were far, far, far off, owing to the fact they did not have telescopes, and you really cannot accurately measure the distance between the earth and moon without a telescope, and this becomes especially true when you try to measure the distance between the earth and the planets, and the earth and the stars. But nevertheless, they at least tried. They also developed theories of evolution. Some of them were evolutionists. Some of them believed that there was possibly life on other planets. And one Greek philosopher said there are worlds with 2 moons, there are worlds with 5 moons, and there are worlds with no moons. He didn't really know that, but nevertheless, he at least might have had some idea what he was talking about, but they speculated and they philosophized, which we'll be talking about in detail as the next few days go about. Now, Greece is a small country and mountainous. A city-state, they might have a city here and a city here, walls, and then the surrounding countryside. And in between the city-states, there might be a big, steep, ragged mountain. And these mountains did a lot to keep the Greeks from uniting. If an army from one city wanted to invade another city, they had to climb a tall, ragged mountain. And during that time, the men might get cut up, worn out, lose their equipment. Then they had to come down the mountain where the fresh army would be waiting for them. And generally, the army that crossed the mountain would tend to lose because they would just simply get worn out, cut up, or whatever on the jagged rocks, or slip and slide and bruise themselves and be in not the best of shape by the time they got to the bottom of the mountain. So the mountains did a lot to keep them apart, and we'll find something else that kept them apart too, was their love of their own local polis, which I'll get to in a little bit. The word polis is the Greek word for city-state. It's when we have places like Minneapolis, or my great-grandfather is buried in a Pennsylvania town called Coraopolis. If you read the Superman books, he's from Metropolis. The polis comes from the Greek word polis. Each city-state then, being independent, was free to develop its own way. And that explains why the 2 city-states we're going to talk about the most, Athens and Sparta, were able to, even though they were close together, they were able to develop in such a diverse manner. Very, very different. Now, the 2 earliest civilizations were the Minoan and Mycenaean. Minoan and Mycenaean. It is believed that Greece might have been united during the time of these two city-states. But then, during the historical period, the Minoan and Mycenaean, what we call prehistory, we don't have actual original sources about them, but we know they exist through archaeology. But we don't have written records. But during the historical period, Greece was not able to unite itself till a Macedonian man named Philip came down from Macedonia here and conquered them from an outsider. But during the historical period, they never united until then. Now, the Minoans. These were people who were living in a region around the Aegean Sea. Now, that meant that they occupied apparently both sides of the Aegean. The Aegean Sea is a little inlet that goes between the Turkey and Greece. And there are a lot of islands here and a very rugged coastline, which means it's an excellent harbors for ships. And these people lived, some of them lived on the island of Crete. So this civilization was very much a seagoing civilization, and it's very old. All right, and folk, by being very old, that means, in my way of thinking, that they were probably prosperous. Now, this may go against what some of the things you've been taught, but I can't emphasize enough. The farther back you go, it seems the more equal the people were in the society, the more advanced they were, and the more able they were able to do things that in some cases we can't do. The Mycenaean civilization, or the Minoan civilization, seems to have not been an exception. All right, now I'm going to digress here for a minute. Have any of you heard any news at all lately about Stonehenge? They have just discovered in the area just of 2 miles from Stonehenge that the little bitty place that we call Stonehenge, I call it little bitty because it's really small compared to what archaeologists have found recently, just 2 miles south, where that buried under the ground are stones that actually dwarf the original Stonehenge. And it's known that this Stonehenge, which is quite large, but buried and undiscovered until now, is much, much older than the Stonehenge that we have been familiar with. Again, older, bigger, and likely more advanced and better. But somehow, due to the course of aging, it got covered over and remained undiscovered until they started using sonar. Hey, there are rocks under here. The rocks are neatly arranged. Again, you can look it up. It made news last week, and I said, I'm going to mention it because it helps confirm what I have believed. The farther back you go in time, the better. This is no exception, folks. The Minoan civilization. Now, we find in the Minoan areas, there are cities, a lot of artifacts that could not have been made here. And apparently, they traded with Mesopotamia, traded with Egypt, and may have gone over here and traded with Spain. But their economy was based a lot on trade. And we find their goods in a lot of cities, particularly in Egypt. They seem to have carried on a whole lot of trade here with Egypt. Greece and Egypt seem to have had a whole lot of contact with each other for many millennia. Then the Minoan civilization abruptly disappeared. We don't know why. Was it conquered by its enemies? Did a big tsunami, otherwise known as a tidal wave, come in and wipe it clean? We don't know. But it appears that they were suddenly and abruptly destroyed, leaving behind only artifacts. And we don't know what happened to them. They were replaced by the Mycenaeans, and the Mycenaeans are in fact Greek. Now, around the years 1800 and 1900 BC, these peoples living up here, we call them Indo-European peoples, began migration southward. The Latins wound up, we'll talk about them in the next chapter, they wound up going to Italy. Then came the Hellenes, otherwise known as Greeks. They wound up coming down here to Greece. Another group of people we've already talked about, the Medes and Persians, went to Persia. And a branch of the Medes and Persians went on to India. We know of them as the Aryans. What made these people move south? And all of them seemed to move about the same time, around the years 1900 to 1800. We simply don't know what made them move south, but I suspect one thing that got them to move was a climate change in the form of a cooling. Now, folks, it appears that the climate has gone up and down, up and down, up and down throughout history. And man's best friend is warming. And man's worst enemy is cooling. A global cooling probably caused a Black Death that killed 1/3 of Europe's population in the early 1300s and killed millions of Chinese at the same time. And then in the late 1600s, we know that was cooling, called the phenomenon called the Little Ice Age, wiped out millions of Europeans, I mean millions, and millions more of Chinese also. The culprit, global cooling. When the climate cools, the plants that used to grow in a certain region can no longer live long enough to bud. And when the plant life goes down, animal life goes down also. When plant and animal life goes down, human life goes down also. Famine results, and people starve, and resistance to disease is lowered. Cooling might have been the factor, but now we can prove it in the 1600s, late 1600s. We can strongly suspect it in the 1300s. Go on the way back to the 4th century, the 300s, when the Roman Empire started to fall. You can't quite prove it, but it's strongly suspected that it was caused by cooling, and mankind had nothing to do with any of it. If I'm being politically incorrect, I make no apologies for it. What's the big deal? Global warming, if it's happening, would be the best thing that ever happened to mankind. Yes?
I was under the impression that global warming caused changes in heat and would cause more extreme variations.
Say again.
I was under the impression that global warming caused more extreme variations in temperature in general, not just global warming.
Actually, if anything, it wets the deserts. I mean, you realize, a whole lot of the area that's above the land, above the water is desert. It wets the deserts, it opens up. I mean, Antarctica once had a tropical climate. I mean, I'm talking down under. The time period was the Cretaceous, and I made sure that I looked it up. Have any ever heard it? I see one head nodding. During the Cretaceous period, Antarctica had a tropical climate with ferns, tropical plants, and animals. In fact, the whole globe had a worldwide tropical climate. Folks, this is standard paleontology. Very standard. And what was life like? This was the era of 200 and 300 foot tall trees. This was the age of the dinosaurs. Life was never better. Snakes got to 100 foot long. Life was never better, never more abundant. I mean, here in Georgia, there's sloths. Little bitty sloths got as big as elephants. Buffaloes got as big as elephants. And what happened? Things cooled down, and a lot of species became extinct. Well, this is standard paleontology, and that's why I would wish somebody would say to the right person, hey, what is the big deal about global warming except for trying to destroy the industrial world? Anybody, I mean, if you want to talk, I'll let you.
I mean, not even destroying the industrial world, but global warming will cause the sea levels to rise. A lot of
Excellent. It would rainfall to, I mean, hey, this whole part of the world, I mean, bigger than the United States, is a huge, vast desert. Let it become wet. All the areas that would be displaced would be opened up, and new areas that are bigger than the ones that would be displaced.
Yeah, but millions of people would die.
Now they could simply get in their cars and move to higher ground. I mean, the sea levels will not rise in an instant, like like Noah's flood. They rise, yes. Oh, I want to say something about that. Go ahead first. All right, about sea levels rising. If you have a cube of ice floating in a bucket of water, and the ice melts, what will it do to the level of the water in the bucket? It would raise it only if the ice were touched. But I said the ice is floating. The ice is floating. And the ice melts. The level of the water does not change. Any ice that's floating in the northern hemisphere, when it melts, it will not raise the ocean levels by even an inch. Now, when it floats, the ice is melting, when it melts on Greenland, that's a little bit different. Or Antarctica. Now, we have 3 miles of ice in Antarctica. Yes?
Yeah, that's what I was going to say.
Yeah.
A lot of the ice
is on top of land. Again, my take on it is when it melts, it would wet a lot of areas that are now dry, and so much of the world that's now uninhabitable would become opened up, and we'd have more land than we have now. Yes?
Well, I worked for FEMA last year, and they were explaining to us how it's becoming a problem because the natural disasters we're seeing are like a much bigger magnitude than they ever have been before, like the hurricanes,
Hurricanes would be greater. Well, here's a story about global warming. I mean, if there's an ice storm, it's blamed on global warming. If there's a hurricane, it's blamed on global warming. If there's an El Nino, it's blamed on global warming. The cold weather is blamed on global warming. And our terrible winters, we've had 2 winters in a row that were pretty bad, blamed on global warming. Well, something's amiss. I mean, there's a story I gotta get off this, but about Al Gore was driving through a blinding snowstorm. The wind was storming. He was having a difficult time seeing and a hard time keeping his car on the road. He was on his way to a meeting to discuss global warming. In the year, 2 years ago, a ship got stuck down in Antarctica. The ship got stuck in ice. They sent a rescue ship and it got stuck in ice. The ship was loaded with scientists who were there to discuss, to measure the thinning Antarctic ice. Did any of you hear about this? It happened, it happened in the winter of 2013, I believe, just a couple of years back. And, all right, and also satellites. I mean, the Earth is warming where the cities are. But then when it's got satellites in orbit, they found out that the warming that they predicted is not happening. Have any of you heard that? At least a couple of you have. Yeah. I mean, in the cities, granted, where you have all the automobile engines and the factories and the big buildings, yeah, they're warming up a little bit. All right, I've got to get off of this. Anyway, people moved south. Among them were the Greeks, the Mycenaeans, and these people were a warlike people. They wrote in a script called Linear B. Now, my very first graduate school term paper was about Linear B. And obviously, if there's a Linear B, there's Linear A. In the case of Linear A, we don't have enough documents to actually decipher it. I mean, I first researched it 44 years ago. 44 years later, we still can't read it, and maybe we never will until we find more Linear A documents. But Linear B, all right, here's a story. During World War II, a lot of people took up cryptography, that is, trying to decipher codes. And the Germans and the Japanese used the same code throughout the war. Oh, big mistake. I can tell you this about the American Army. The American Army changes its codes every day. If the enemy gets today's code, it won't do them any good tomorrow. But we learned that then when the war was over, a bunch of these same code breakers took up deciphering an ancient language, and they made a startling discovery. Oh, the word linear means that it was written to script from left to right like our script. It wasn't written like the hieroglyphics or like the cuneiform. It was written in linear script, and they discovered it was written in Greek language. And this was a shocker. They did not know. But this proved the Mycenaeans were, in fact, Greek. Something that we had not known until about 1952 or 53. Before that, we thought the Mycenaeans were non-Greek period. Well, now we come to a time period called the Dark Age, and we're going to run into this term again. Dark Age only means that we don't have a lot of written records. It doesn't mean that the time period was necessarily dark. it means that somehow their writings have not come down to us. Maybe they wrote on paper that didn't last long or whatever. But anyway, the Dark Age. We know very little about it. It's a period from early Mycenaean times until they started using the Phoenician alphabet. In the 700s BC, the Greeks adopted the Phoenician alphabet. The Phoenician alphabet, and that is the alphabet that the Greek language still uses. The letters alpha, beta, gamma, delta, epsilon, and so forth. You'll see these letters on fraternity houses. We still sometimes use them today. Sorority houses still use these letters, tau, zeta, whatever, omega. These are the letters that they used. And they started writing Phoenician alphabet, which is much easier writing than Linear B ever was, or much easier to learn in cuneiform or hieroglyphics or any of the old ways of writing. So they adopted the Phoenician alphabet. But we do have a body of literature, though, that does come from the Dark Age. Hopefully most of you have heard about it. This body of literature was written by a blind poet named Homer. All right. Now, Homer, the two titles of his two works are the Iliad and Odyssey. And before us proceed, how many of you have run into the Iliad and Odyssey? All right, most of you. For those of you who haven't, the Iliad was the story of a 10-year-long war that the Greeks fought between Greece and Troy. Troy was a city located right up here on Asia Minor. Okay, this area has been called the Ottoman Empire. It's been called Turkey. It's been called Asia Minor. It's been called the land of the Hatti, as in Hittites. But for right now, we'll call it Asia Minor. Now later, the Greeks called it Ionia. So it's had several names. In modern terms, it's called Turkey. But anyway, Troy was located right up in here. So Greeks would cross the seas and fight the people of Troy. And after 10 years, they gave up. But during the time that they were fighting against Troy, some woman was told that her son was going to die in battle. And she was determined something wouldn't happen. She went to the gods, and the gods said, if you can dip him in a river Styx, he will be invulnerable. So she dipped all of them in the river Styx, except she held on to one of his heels. But the rest of them was submerged in the river, and she pulled him out of the river, and he was invulnerable except for that heel. Well, somebody noticed that he stepped on a sharp rock and cut himself with that heel. So this person got together a poison arrow and shot him in the heel with a poison arrow and killed him. Again, these were stories that the Greeks called tragedies. The tragedy is we're under this when we talk about literature, but I'll tell you now. A tragedy is a story where the hero of the story dies. And also, the Greeks had a certain type of fatalism about them too, that what the gods had willed could not be changed. What will be, and we can do nothing about it. Very similar to the word fatalism we ran into with the Chinese. And most of you, I think, got it right on the test. What will be, and we cannot change or alter it. Again, I'm not saying this is true, especially since I don't really believe it, but nevertheless, I have to teach because they believe it. The Trojan War finally ended when the Greeks told the Trojans, you have won, we can't take your city, but we're going to give you a big gift to honor your victory. The big gift was a wooden horse on wheels. Well, the Trojans wheeled the horse inside, unaware that inside the horse were a bunch of Greek soldiers. In the meantime, the Greek army marched away, and once it got just out of sight, over the hill, you might say, they stopped the march and waited till darkness. When darkness came, the soldiers inside the horse went to the gates and opened up the gates from inside to let all their buddies from outside in. The Greek soldiers then set fire to the city of Troy, and that was the end of Troy forever. Now, as is the case of a lot of these ancient stories, both gods are involved, supernatural elements are involved, things are involved today's historians simply cannot believe. but I must emphasize, the Greeks believed that this story of the Iliad was serious, true history. Now, I had a classmate when I sat in Mr. Woods' history class in high school. I don't even remember the man's first name, but world history. This man is now professional hire. He said, oh yeah, they exaggerated. After a while, they stretched the story a little bit and gods became involved. You might believe that if you want to. You can believe what you want to. Personally, I suspect the Greeks were a little bit too sophisticated for that, and they would have known the difference between real and true. But again, the stories that you read about in the Iliad and Odyssey, how much of them can you believe? You'll have to decide for yourself, folk. But all the ancient peoples began their history with stories that today we call myth, and the myths went from there to legends. No exceptions. And now, what proof is there? Well, here's the proof. In the late 1700s, somebody took it on himself to find the city of Troy, and he found it near where the poet Homer said it would be located. Actually found it exactly where Homer said it was located. And when they started digging around the area, I mean, it was covered over with, like all these cities, covered over with a lot of silt. When they started digging, they discovered to the last time Troy was inhabited, it was destroyed by fire. That's all the evidence we have that the Iliad is true. Okay, go ahead and laugh if you want to, but that's in the records book. The city was destroyed by fire. All right, then the Odyssey. If you think the Iliad is fantastic, the Odyssey features the hero of the story, the king, named, now in the Greeks he's called Odysseus, and I believe in the Romans called him Ulysses, same person. Anyway, the hero started to go home, and on his way home, a big storm blew him off course, and he wound up going all different places. Now, 30 years ago, I read an article, and regrettably I can't find the article now, but I read an article where this man actually believed that we should take the Odyssey as being serious history. He said that the ship actually blew off course and went all the way across the Atlantic before the storms settled. I mean, that storms were more violent in those days than they are now. And took him all the way, and he actually went to a river called the Amazon. The Amazon women were warriors, were stronger than the men. And he actually found his way back. And of course, the story features giants, women who could sing so well they would enchant you, magic that could turn persons into humans, a one-eyed Cyclops who was a giant of a man but had one eye. These stories are found in the Odyssey. And again, this author was saying that we should pay more attention to what the ancients said and not look on them as being primitive of mind. They believe, folk, I don't know how to emphasize it, the Greeks believed that the Odyssey was true and serious history. And every ancient peoples have stories about miracles and the supernatural in the stories of the beginnings that we today are skeptical about. And you can believe what you want to. Anyone have any comments? Yes?
I think going back to the Iliad and where, like, from Troy,
Yeah, they found
burned and
Troy.
stuff like that. Like, I haven't done enough research on it, obviously, or anything, but just like, I mean, how can we conclude that all of the Iliad is true based off of
That is a really, really good
because
point. Well, it's like we've gotten
cities that
A
are
part
burned
of
out
it's
as a
true.
common?
We've got a part of it that appears to be true, but that does not sanction the rest of it. We have not found, for instance, a wooden horse with wheels on it, or a burned out horse, but we have not found that. But it probably would not have lasted through the big fire anyway. But it does not, by itself, prove that the rest of it is true. It's like, it's sometimes called the tip of the iceberg. It's known that icebergs, you'll see the tip, and you have to be careful because the rest, 90% of the iceberg is on the water. And you can try to avoid the tip and wind up hitting the part of the iceberg you can't see. Good point, really good point. Anybody else? All right. These epic poems tell us a lot about the the world in which the Greeks lived, it tells us that the aristocrats ruled the land and aristocratic values. The aristocrats in those days valued courage and honor. They used the term arete, which doesn't have a real good translation in English. It can be translated virtue, it can be translated courage, it can be translated honor, but then again, there are cases where it was said that a horse, some horses had arete, where we don't think of horses as having honor or virtue, but horses might have courage. But anyway, it's an untranslatable word, and I should have written it in italics. What was lacking was values of cooperation and community values. It was all me and my ability to fight. Cooperation and community, the Greeks were to learn later, but learn at a terrible expense of being divided before they learned the values of cooperation and community, which was to come later. All right. Okay, Greek city-states. As I've already mentioned, they're centered around the polis, and again, that word should be italicized also. A man's loyalty was to his local polis, the area, in other words, of his city, and the surrounding countryside. A polis consists of city, and the city usually had walls around it, and then the surrounding countryside was where the farmers lived. And the houses were more scattered. In time of war, the farmers would abandon their farmlands and go and live inside the walls until the war ended. And this created a lot of disease, and because a lot of people who went inside the walls caught diseases that they might not have caught had they not gone into the walls. Then if they had not gone into the walls, the enemy might have had them. Now, we experienced some of the same thing in our own country. During the Civil War, Southerners like Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson chose to fight for the South because they were Southerners. Purely, I mean, it's been said that Stonewall Jackson did not believe in slavery, but he was a Virginian, so he fought for the state of Virginia. And what restored the Confederacy was the Confederate soldier was more interested in his own state than he was the whole Confederacy. This, I mean, you can check in the records to be true. Robert E. Lee, again, fought for the South. He was a Virginian. Now, there were a few exceptions. There was a general named General Thomas, who was a Southerner, but who fought for the North. And Admiral Farragut, who became America's first admiral, was a Southerner himself. And the people said, as long as you're going to fight for the South, I believe the Union ought to be reserved. I'm pro-Union. And he became an admiral in the American Navy, even though he was a Southerner. There were some exceptions, but for the most part, the people fought for their own states. I mean, the Southerners fought for their state more than they did their country. The Greeks, their idea of a polis, where they were more concerned with the polis than they were about Greece itself, this helped to keep the Greeks from uniting. Now, while they were involved with this polis, they developed a new military system called the phalanx, hoplite. These two words go together, hoplite and phalanx. The phalanx was, I believe, was a formation. I don't want to emphasize it too much, but basically the hoplite phalanx. Here is the idea. You went into battle, and for purposes of this, I'm going to pretend I'm right-handed. So I hold my sword in my right hand and my shield in the left hand. But you did not put your shield out here to protect yourself. The hoplite troops put their shield out here to protect the man next to them. And in turn, they were protected by the man next to them. The idea was you protect your buddy. Then that way you're fighting as a team. All right. Now I want to digress for a minute because I'll talk about this again when we come to the American Indians. You never hear of the American Indians troops being called soldiers or troops. They were not soldiers. Now I'm not saying they had the courage to fight. They were brave. They were courageous. But they could not organize into an army. When the Indians went to war, like one Indian would look around for some enemy who might be his size, and they'd fight it out until one of them destroyed the other. Then the winner would look around, who else can I fight? Who's about to pick on? Who's someone about my size? and they'd fight that person until, that was destroyed. There was no teamwork. Again, if the Greeks had met the American Indians, I'm sure that a few Greeks could have clobbered them because the Greeks had organization. But they fought in units. Now, they oftentimes lined them in a 4 deep. That way, if the man on the front fell, the second man behind was expected to come up and take the place of the man in the front. Now, the big weakness to this was you could defeat a phalanx army if you get around their flank. So the Greeks were real careful to protect their flank, particularly, seemed like their right flank was one which they did not just say that most people are right-handed and held their swords right-handed. True, but the Greeks were told to distance us so much that no matter what happens, face the front. And all their armor they wore, such it was, all the protections on the front, their backs were bare. And again, this was guaranteed to make sure their armor did not weigh them down, but they did not protect their backs. So if you could get around their flank, you could win. So the Greeks would pick their best troops and a few horses they had. The land of Greece is not conducive to horse racing because it's not a fertile land and wide open pastures are not common. So they didn't have very many horses. Only the very wealthiest of them had horses. But the Hoplites challenged the old aristocratic order and showed that the cavalry system was outdated. The Hoplites could even take on mounted horsemen, again, because they stood wall to wall as a team, and they were highly disciplined. Stay together. Don't let the gap form in your ranks. Fill in the gap really fast, because when a gap formed, you were subject to being defeated. So you keep that in mind as we talk about the wars that they fought. Now, as the Greeks began to farm and realized the population was getting bigger, they began to fan out. A bunch of them spread over here into Asia Minor. A bunch of them spread over here into Italy and Sicily, and a bunch of them to Sardinia and Corsica, these islands here, and some of them probably spread into North Africa, and even as far away as southern France and Spain. They began to fan out. And this promoted trade because they began to send some of their goods back to their relatives back in Greece, so they began to trade, but it also eventually brought them into conflict with the Persian Empire. Now, during this time, as trade increased, trade can make some people wealthy. A new class of wealthy sprang up. Now, folk, this brings back a few, an unpleasant memory for me because I missed this on the test when I was in grad school. Essentially, but what happened? They had the old aristocratic order. Now, the word aristocrat means people who are born. These are people who are born into wealth. But then they had a bunch of people who were born into poverty who became wealthy. And a lot of your aristocrats lost their wealth. They would still have the titles they inherited, but they lost their wealth. And they were really jealous of these new rich who had come along the scene and who were all of a sudden wealthy. And this created a lot of conflict, but eventually it challenged the old aristocratic order, and the aristocrats faded by the wayside, and new generations of rich came along the scene that broke the power of the old aristocracy. Now we come to the word tyrant here also. Tyrants, now we think of a tyrant as being a bad person. It has a bad connotation. The Greeks did not necessarily think so. A tyrant was a person who achieved power by a coup. Coup d'etat meant that he would kill the person who had been in power to take power himself. And yes, I've known of coups in my lifetime, particularly in Latin America. There were a lot of coups 30 and 40 years ago. And in the Far East, where a lot of times a dictatorship would take over. Yes?
I think it's ETH.
Well, let's see, how is it? It's spelled different ways, but it's not spelled at all the way it sounds. D apostrophe, E-D-A-T. Coup d'etat, and it's pronounced like coup d'etat. It's a foreign word. Sometimes it's just called a coup for short. Now, it is not spelled the way it sounds. The P is silent. Yeah, I hope that's bothering you. The P is silent. Coup d'etat. The T, the last T is silent. Anyway, tyrants would take over by coup. Then they would used mercenaries to maintain their power. That is, they hired, a mercenary means a hired soldier. Essentially, the tyrants got to be tyrants because they could buy an army, and they would buy a bunch of trained troops and say, hey, you follow me. And once in power, or even to get to power, they allied themselves with the merchants and traders, or the money people. So they got to power basically by money, and remained in power by money. But while they were in power, they oftentimes would construct temples, build walls, make marketplaces, but eventually the tyrannies came to an end also. Now, this led to a lot of Greek philosophers, particularly Plato and Aristotle, say that there was a natural order of things, that governments would start out with a monarchy, in other words, a king. And he would, the word king means he passes it from father to son, rules by what you call divine right. You're born into it. Then the kings would give way to aristocracy, rule by the rich. As they got tired of their king, then the aristocracy would give way to an oligarchy. Not much different. I mean, it was all ruled by the rich, except the aristocracy was rich who were born into it. The oligarchs were rich who acquired it. The oligarchy would eventually give way to a tyranny, as the people would wonder, well, just who's in charge here, and the tyrant would finally come forth and say, I am. And at the bottom of the list, and most people was, tyranny would give way to a democracy. All right. Then democracy would last a while, and after a while people would say, oh, we're tired of this, it's too much lawlessness, too much chaos, and also too much debt. The democracy then would give way back to a one-man rule, a demagoguery, or a demagogue. A very popular person who would sometimes take over legal means, and folk, I was reminded recently, Adolf Hitler took over Germany using Germany's constitution by perfectly legal means. Now, I am thinking of a certain country in this world today that owes more money than it can pay. And I'm not thinking about the United States. What country owes more than it can pay, and its bad economics have brought down the whole world's economy recently? Greece. Yes. The Greeks, what they did 2,300 years ago, they're still doing. Somebody, we don't know who said it, said democracy works until the people find they can dip their hand into the public pot. And they start pulling money from the public treasury to put it in their own pockets. Then they don't work, they become lazy. And also, lawlessness ensues. Socrates talked about this. Democracy was to get a bad name from which it did not recover from until modern times. Now, is that likely to happen to us? Time will tell. I will say in my own lifetime, most democracies, particularly Latin America and the Far East, have failed. The Philippines started out with democracy, Singapore did, and your African countries tried it for a while. And in general, they'll last until chaos takes charge. And people get tired of all the banditry and outlawry and poverty and demand some kind of order. And into this scenario steps some kind of a demagogue. And the result is democracy ends. All right. In some cases, yes?
Sorry, what's the definition of a demagogue again?
Demagogue, oh, that's a rule by a very popular, charismatic leader who can charm his way into power. Adolf Hitler was something of a demagogue, except he's very evil. But a person who sees the chaos the democracy brings and comes in and promises, if you appoint me, give me the power, I will do this and this for you. I can end this recession. I can bring law and order. I can bring under control all the street gangs. And I can make our country powerful once again. I can keep our enemies out. Demagogue. All right. Reminds me of Trump. Oh, never mind. I didn't say that. right. All right, anyway. Modern times, all over again. Now, we come to two city-states, Sparta and Athens. Sparta first. Again, that's the way your book does it. Sparta. Sparta was not located on the seacoast, but unlike Athens, Athens was. But early on, Sparta conquered its neighboring state of Messenia and made these Messenian slaves. The Messenians, by the way, this one claimed to be descended from Hercules. Anyway, the Spartans made slaves of them, and they called them Helots. Well, Messenia revolted at one point. Sparta was able to win the fight with the Messenians and keep the Messenians in slavery temporarily. They actually kept them in slavery for about 300 years. Well, Sparta then realized we have to make sure that these Messenians never ever rise again and take over, because otherwise they'll enslave us. So they made their country into one big military camp. Every man was a soldier. And they frowned on art, they frowned on music. They did not want their people visiting the rest of Greece to say you might become like them, we were the best. They didn't want other people from outside visiting them. They told their people, don't form friendships. You're better than they are. And also do not marry outside of Sparta. And I hope this proved to be a huge mistake. They wound up becoming smaller and smaller as time went on, due to what amounted to inbreeding. If I could go back in time, I'd advise them, hey, if you really want to create a race of super warriors, get some of your men to go to Spain, some of your men that go to deep in Africa, and some that go to the Far East, as far as maybe China, and have your women get men from these places, and your men marry wives from these places far away, and you might create a race of strong super warriors. But they did something else too. When a baby was born, the parents were allowed to keep the baby for 1 month. This was true whether the baby was a boy or girl. After 1 month, Spartan doctors would examine the baby. If the baby did not appear healthy, the parents were told to take the baby out to a remote area. It was called exposing, and leave the baby, drop the baby off and leave it to starve. A lot of ancients did this, and this practice, by the way, was to go on until finally Christianity stopped it some hundreds of years later. But exposing babies that you did not want for one reason or another was a common practice in the ancient world. In the case of Sparta, it wound up helping to destroy the Spartan population, to where eventually those Helots outnumbered them. First 2 to 1, 3 to 1, 4 to 1, 5 to 1, and 6 to 1. And eventually the Helots wound up whipping the Spartans. But that's jumping ahead of the story a little bit. Supposedly Sparta was founded by a lawgiver called Lycurgus. In the middle of this term, Lycurgus, is the word cur, which is a Greek word for dog. And some people believe that Lycurgus may have been a dog that they simply used as a symbol for their lawgiver, and not a real man at all. We don't know if Lycurgus actually existed, but if he did, suppose he set the laws that Sparta was to live by. Now, one thing that helped keep the Spartan population down was their young men were to live in barracks until they were 30. Oh, they were allowed to marry up before then, but they were not allowed to see their wives unless they managed to somehow sneak off. But then the barracks were so well guarded that most of the men who tried to sneak off were caught. And obviously this had the effect of keeping Sparta's population lower than it otherwise would have been. All these factors worked together to weaken Sparta. But at first, they created what appeared to be super soldiers. They tried hard to desensitize their men, exposing the young men from the time military training started at age 6. And they were exposed them to all kinds of dangers. Every boy was whipped in public at least once a year, whether he had done any bad deed or not. They were fed less than they needed, and they were told, not any other food you have, you must steal, but don't get caught. If you get caught, you'll be whipped. So they learned how to somehow be able to steal without getting caught. Their girls also underwent a lot of training to desensitize them. And part of the training was they had to dance completely nude in the city streets and squares in public at least once a year. And this was designed to desensitize them. And the women would pride themselves on when the men went to war, they'd say either come back with your shield or on it. In other words, it was considered a big disgrace to leave your shield in battle. If you left your shield in battle, I mean, it was just a dishonor, but your shield was to protect not just yourself, but the man next to you. And actually, your shield was to protect the man next to you, not yourself. So if you dropped your shield, I mean, you know. But now later, some Athenians developed a different idea. They said, if your battle is hopelessly lost, one poet said, yeah, sure, I left my shield in battle. Well, why did I throw it down? Well, the thing was in my way. What's the big deal? I can get another one. I mean, his side had lost the battle. He saw he had no chance to win. His only chance to survive was throw his shield down and run. And of course, he could run fast enough because the enemy was not going to throw their shield down to pursue him. So he got away. He lived, got another shield. If you think he was a coward, he went out and fought again. Next time he won. But those values would come later. But the Spartans, oh no, we never throw. So the Spartan women would tell the men, come back either with your shield or on it. Or dead or alive. And your book talked about one Spartan woman whose husband died in battle, and one of her female friends asked her, aren't you grieving? She said, oh no, I'm really happy. My husband died the way he wanted to. He lived the life he wanted. Today's psychologists say this is the worst way in the world to handle grief. Pretend you don't have it, pretend that, oh, it's wonderful and great. No, it's not wonderful, it's not great. But this was the way the Spartan women were conditioned to from the time they were young. Now, change was a no-no, yes.
Sorry, Lycurgus, you said is probably not an actual.
He might
man.
not be an actual person. We don't know that for sure. He might. It almost sounds like he was a dog.
Okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
I guess I'm just. Okay.
Who they set up as their lawgiver. And sometimes, believe it or not, these people will think that if the law comes from a dog, who's a god, like that it actually has more validity than would if it came from a fellow human. They gave it almost a divine element to it that it otherwise would not have had. It was a godlike dog, or a dog-like dog, whatever you call it. That gave their laws some clout, in other words, more so than it otherwise would have. But again, we don't know that for sure. Lycurgus may actually have been a real flesh and blood person. Now, folks, I want to say this before I close. I grew up during the Cold War. The Cold War was fought between the United States and Soviet Union. And that's not to say that we're not at war with Russia right now. Some people believe we are on two fronts. Crimea and Syria. But leaving that for the moment, it disturbed me to think that the war between Sparta and Athens, and there's going to be a war between Sparta and Athens, we'll talk about next time. In the war between Sparta and Athens, Sparta won. And like, is this an honor? In other words, does the side that lacks freedom decide that Sparta reminded me of Russia, the Soviet Union, and Athens was the United States. All right, in the short run, folks, Sparta won. But fast forward to the year 2015, Athens today has 2 million people. Sparta is a ghost town. Herdsmen graze their sheep and goats among the stone ruins of what once was Sparta. There are 200 people living in the top of a mountain who claim to be Spartans, and they're a sorry lot, completely impoverished and inbred and very, very sickly. These are all that's left of Sparta. In the long run, Sparta lost. But in the initial conflict between Athens and Sparta, Sparta won. Now, next time we'll talk more about Athens. Well, and we'll go talk about Athens. Then the whole narrative is interrupted by Persia. Persia wound up invading Greece 2 times. The Greeks fought them off, and then eventually the conflict between Athens and Sparta led to a big war in which the Spartans were to win. And this eventually led to Alexander the Great. In the meantime, there'll be the philosophers Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, and I have spent a lot of time particularly studying Socrates. I mean, he fascinates me. Not that I agree with hardly anything he said. Nevertheless, he managed to get the people's attention. Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, then there was Pythagoras and Pythagorean theorem. Okay, with that, Everybody have a good weekend, and hope to see you on Monday.